Hey guys, what's up? Swim here. It's very late at night, as you can clearly tell by my almost imperceptible figure here. And welcome to another episode of Meta whenever the hell I feel like it. Anyway, this week on Meta, whenever the hell I feel like it, we have a pretty interesting one because, of course, the balance patch update came through. So I'm just gonna breeze through this real quick. This is just gonna take like 30 seconds. I'm gonna go over notable things. Karma's going to 6 mana. There's a chance Shen will end up seeing play. Vi is going to 4 health, which hurts PNZ decks a little bit, but she's still going to be pretty strong. Ranger goes to 3 power, which hurts Demacia decks a lot, but he's still going to be pretty strong. Badgerbear goes to 3 power, which actually makes him start to see a lot of cuts in some Demacia decks. Standalone is dead. Rearguard gets donked to 1 health, pretty big. Tavern Keeper is very strong all of a sudden. Deep Meditation gets a nerf, still good. Boomker Ricky gets a nerf, still good. Brood Awakening gets a nerf, quite bad now. And there's a chance people will run Slotbot and like Twisted Fate decks. And that's the patch in a nutshell. So basically, let's go ahead and get this on. This is going to be the meta sheet that we have. I tend to do these Meta Mondays very stat driven and very like, okay, these are the stats coming in next week and this is how I'm evaluating those stats. Whenever there's a balance patch though, I'm forced to kind of like predict where I expect the meta to end up. So take this week's one with a bit of a grain of salt. Now we have a pretty narrow tier 1, a very wide tier 2, and a fairly narrow tier 3. The reason for that is because there's a lot of new interesting decks that feel like there's room for them in the meta with some changes such as tier 1 just getting nerfed across the board, Burn getting a bit worse. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically there's a lot of kind of like new, potentially uprising decks that could actually be decent. And, we'll end up seeing how good they are at the end of the day. It is sort of, partially, I'm positive not all of these decks will end up staying in tier 2, but I think that there's some real potential in some of the new blood. So as always, you can find the link to all of these decks if you want to check them out yourselves, or of course this site in the pinned comment. Real quick before I'm talking about individual lists, let's briefly mention that in terms of meta implications, right now the biggest thing is that tier 1 got nerfed across the board, Burn aggro being one of the ones that got hit, and that was sort of like stopping a lot of decks from being ran in the meta. Now the meta will slow down a tiny bit, not that much, not as much as I kind of was initially feeling. So the meta is going to slow down a bit. That's going to pave the way for a lot of decent decks to come through, and any decks that didn't get nerfed, such as like those belonging to Bilgewater, maybe Freljord, are going to see, a rise in experimentation and maybe eventual play rate. Overall, I don't expect any new decks to just come out of nowhere and take like a tier 1 throne. It's mostly coming down to nerfs as opposed to buffs. If anything has a chance, it's something banking on Kindly Tavern Keeper, which is a really good card all of a sudden. And that could carry Freljord. But overall, what this patch is going to mean is that, yeah, tier 1 decks are still going to be archetypes that we know and are familiar with, but it paves the way for a ton of tier 2 decks to kind of like fill the missing gaps in tier 2. Okay, so we're just going to start right at the top, and here I'm just going to be breaking down every single deck, roughly, not talking like too much about specifics. This is Heimerdinger Vi. It's my personal version of Heimerdinger Vi, which is literally, it's not like a deck that I have like done like a crazy big brain surge theory. Like this is basically just Alan's deck, which is like the normal Vi Heimer deck. In this case, we have 1 Static Shock over 1 Solitary Monk, which I quite like and comes in pretty good on the stats. I've largely been a proponent of 1, in some metas, 2 Static Shocks and Heimerdinger. Deep Meditation right now obviously getting nerfed, but Heimerdinger Vi is the one deck that can use it pretty well despite the nerf. Because of course, now that it's going to 5 mana, when it's discounted, it'll be 3 mana. And that means Heimerdinger can get extra 3 mana turrets, which is kind of the whole point of Heimerdinger. You just want to play as many 3 mana turrets as possible. So this is a deck that's not going to be too different. It's going to play very similar to before the patch. And even though it did get a bit nerfed, everything else in tier 1 got nerfed. And this deck is well positioned to basically, stay and maintain a tier 1 slot. One thing to note is we might actually see some people switching back to Karma instead of Vi, depending on kind of how the meta might end up. If you want to play later versus playing a bit more of a tempo role, because of course this used to be Heimer Karma before Vi slotted in that role. Anyway, next up we've got Karma Ezreal. Now Karma Ezreal has been a strong deck for a while. It has been largely underrepresented in the last update. Heimerdinger Vi was getting a lot of attention. Karma Ezreal felt mostly like it was getting blasted by Burn, and kind of held back by other like tier 1 decks. Stuff like Demacia was really strong, so you would rather be in maybe Karma Lux. But now Demacia is very nerfed, Burn is pretty nerfed. Karma Ezreal is in a very, very good position to climb up the rankings. And this is my personal take on the Karma Ezreal variants. Now, there's a couple different variants of this list going around. Some of them are running like 2 progress day. You'll see some of them at like 2 or 3. I don't know if I've actually seen 3 health potions, but 2 health potions is also pretty common. A lot of it is just kind of like minor ratio changing, but overall it's a pretty straightforward deck. You're just stalling and surviving, casting a lot of spells to trigger a lot of your spell synergy cards while you are waiting to get your Ezreal and Karma leveled up. When you play them leveled up, you're kind of winning the game off of them. Fairly straightforward. In this case, we've cut Deep Meditation down from a 3 of to a 2 of. Now, I might end up reverting that change. We'll have to see how playing on the new Deep Meditation feels, but when it costs 3 mana, it does become a lot more clunky. You'll certainly never be able to do like something like a double meditation turn, so it definitely has a little bit too much potential as a 3F to brick out your hand. But yeah, something that's really important to note is that in the current version of the game, with the current cards we have in the meta state we're in, it's really hard to run a control deck without Ionia, and we've seen that, you know, with Heimerdinger Vi. I wouldn't call Heimerdinger Vi control, but it does have a lot of control properties. Karma Ezreal, as well as like Karma Lux. And the biggest reason for that is just because Will of Ionia and Deny in a lot of ways, but I think the biggest thing is just Will of Ionia will have a it makes it really hard to beat Ionia with another control deck. So it's really good at winning the late game mirrors. Like when you take an example of something like, you know, Swain Leviathan, which is a pretty solid control deck, it's getting quite a bit better in this update just because everything else is getting worse. Bilgewater and Swain feel fine, but when you drop Leviathan on 8 and it just gets like Will of Ionia'd, usually that's like quite game ending. Ionia will be able to kill, or any control deck. It's not because of Ionia at that point, but like, you know, you're gonna be dead before you can really play it a second time and capitalize off of it. And the same is true with stuff like They Who Endure, Tryndamere, or Sea Monsters. A lot of those decks just get pretty destroyed by Will of Ionia. Okay, next up we've got Bannerman. This is a visual bug. This should be Demacia, because Bannerman is reverting back to its pure form. Now, I think Bannerman might end up being better in this case than Karma Lux. They were a bit close. It was neck and neck for a while. I think a lot of people were favoring Karma Lux at the end there as kind of the go-to way to play Demacia, and it was very powerful. Karma Lux received the nerf probably bigger than Bannerman. So the reason Karma Lux was better than Bannerman was because Karma Lux was much more able than Bannerman to capitalize on the value of the new cards, right? Like Bannerman had to cut cards it didn't want to cut, like Lorem Protege. Grizzled Ranger is good in Bannerman, but it's kind of conflicting with the 4. You don't need, you know, the 3-drop 4/4 quite as much in something like Bannerman as you might have in Karma Lux. And of course, you've got all the new Ionia tools. Here now, we have kind of the opposite situation. Now that those components are getting nerfed, the Ionia tool is getting nerfed, Grizzled Ranger is getting nerfed, and Badger Bear is getting nerfed. Kind of all the things that made Karma Lux better than Bannerman for a bit there are getting taken away. I personally expect Bannerman to be kind of the go-to Demacia deck yet again, but Karma Lux is still a surviving deck, and we'll have to see how that goes. What you see here is currently my personal way of playing Bannerman. Again, this is a pretty locked-in archetype. You can change one card here, one card there. You know, you can run 1 Ranger's Resolve or 2. You can run anywhere between like 1 and 3 Reposts. There's some versions that run 0. I don't really quite like that. 1 or 2 Spirits, 0 or 1 Concerted Strikes. The one big question is, do you run Lorem Protege or Loyal Badger Bear? Do you take the 2 attack or the 2 attack with a Challenger, or the 3 attack? Because of course Badger Bear is a 3/4 now. I tend to like Protege a little bit better than Badger Bear in this deck. The biggest thing is that you kind of only need 3 attack. Protege is really good if it just gets +1/+1 from anything, and both Bannerman and Warchefs will give you that. That's kind of all you need. All you need is to give this +1/+1 from one of those sources, and then Lorem Protege becomes pretty nuts. So I'm a pretty big fan of Protege hitting the list yet again. I mean, back in the day, it's a very, very powerful card, and as good as Badger Bear is, and Badger Bear is very good, Bannerman did hurt to cut Laurent Protege out of it. Bannerman is pretty well positioned in the meta. Experienced Burn players had a pretty good win rate against Bannerman, so that definitely was hurting them a little bit, as well as Brood Awakening, just, you know, being like the triple trump is kind of like what you needed against Bannerman, and Brood Awakening has pretty much gone away. So Bannerman is well positioned to just maintain their tier 1 status. I don't think anything's really changing there. And then we've got Burn aggro. So Burn aggro has, you know, it's going to see some changes here, and look at that, we're running Teemo. So Teemo is actually a consideration for Burn aggro. It has been in the past. It's basically a worse version of Precious Pet. When you do the math on the poison puff caps, well, it totally depends on how long the game is going to go for. It depends how many cards your opponent is drawing, and it depends which turn you're attacking with the Teemo. But when you do all the math, on average, you'll end up with something like the 5 puff caps being worth 0.6 or 0.7 damage, something like that. So basically Teemo is sort of like a Precious Pet that has 1.7 attack, and you're sacrificing 0.3 attack for the elusive upgrade instead of the fearsome, which is probably a little bit better overall, but kind of hasn't been run over Pet in the past for that reason. Now that Rearguard has gotten nerfed down to 1 HP, I quite like Teemo back in this role, and he is just a nice replacement to Rearguard as your 1-drop. Of course, Rookie, despite being nerfed, is still a card you will certainly run. And by the way, there is also a consideration to still run Rearguard, just because, I mean, it does slap big, you know, like you can still get it in for 3 in a lot of situations. I personally don't like the idea of running Rearguard here anymore. So overall, this deck isn't really, it's basically this 1-card swap. Everything else is just kind of the same as it has been for a long time. Now, where does Burn fit into this meta? I think Burn is going to be a strong deck. I think Burn is actually almost not, I think it's going to lose almost no points on its win rate at all. Now, the thing to understand is that Burn is almost certainly going to lose a stake in the ladder, right? It's going to lose a lot of play rate. The reason for that is just being a little bit weaker. So Burn exists in a position where it kind of forces opponents to build and play a specific kind of deck. So when you nerf Burn a little bit, there will be a lot of people for the first week, or especially for the first few days, that are kind of like assuming Burn is dead and maybe just overcutting their healing and stuff like that. And of course, when you have a situation like that, yeah, Burn will still survive and they'll still do decently. I've thought about this a lot, and I don't expect Burn to really go anywhere. There is a chance I will be on Meta Mondays next week on Tuesday, and we'll be looking at Burn back in tier 1. I think that's possible. Overall, it's still a good deck. I don't think it's going to be bad, but it will lose a lot of play rate, I think, and that is very significant. It's less accessible as a budget deck now because it requires a champion. Like when you go to meta stats, the fact that why isn't this updating? What the heck? The fact that when you, okay, I don't know what's happening with this meta stats page. It seems to be bugging out. But basically, when you look at the play rates, Burn has like double the play rate of the next the runner-up deck, and that's definitely not something that we're going to be seeing next week. So don't worry, Burn might still have a pretty good win rate, but you are going to be seeing less of it on ladder. It's really important to keep that in mind, because as the deck's win rate goes up, its play rate goes down. Well, sorry, I said that backwards. As its play rate goes up, its win rate goes down, but vice versa is true as well, because of course you'll see like meta responses and stuff like that. So what matters isn't win rate, but the win rate to play rate ratio, and Burn is getting nerfed in that regard, but you'll see it in the play rate as opposed to the win rate. Okay, so then we've got Vikkarina. Now this is a deck that's getting pretty nerfed. I think it still will probably exist as an archetype, but the biggest thing is they lost Brood Awakening. Going to 6 mana is, I think I would say, a death sentence for that card, although it's very possible Brood Awakening is still good in this list. I mean, you still do often want something that is going to provide a lot of chump blockers and maybe put some, you know, opportunities for tempo on the board. In this case, we've cut it. We're still running Vi because Vi is still a good card, and we've replaced it for kind of the other tech options. We're running Hapless Aristocrats and a lot of draw in the form of Double Glimpse and Double Static Shock to be able to kind of make up for the lower curve we have with Hapless Aristocrat. Anyway, we'll see how good this deck ends up being. There are some people that think it's still going to be just tier 1 easily, and some people that think the deck is super dead. It did get double nerfed, and that's a big deal, but it was also a good deck before it had Vikkarina, and it's not impossible that Brood still ends up being ran there. Lux Karma is in a similar camp, another very powerful deck that received big nerf. This is BBG's version of Lux Karma. This is currently a very strange position. I was looking at this deck for a while. I was thinking about it a lot in terms of like ways to change it and adapt it for the new update. I have decided that it is very solid as it is. I could see, I need to play around with it and adjust some of the ratios. There's a chance that Deep Meditation could come down to a 2F. There's a chance Badger Bear gets swapped out, although Grizzled Ranger will almost certainly still remain in the deck. Badger Bear becomes kind of like the more flexible card. Its nerf was more impactful than Ranger. Ranger still ends up being just a bit of a power card overall and still synergizes with, hey, stuff like Radiant Guardian. But really, this is a deck that, even though 3 of its cards got nerfed, you don't really have to play it very differently. And don't get me wrong, when I come back next week and, we've played it more on the patch, I've played this list around a little bit, refined it, and we figured out kind of like a slightly better pattern to it. Maybe we replace Badger Bear for something else at some quantity. That might happen, but overall, none of these 3 cards becomes out of place from these nerfs, which does speak, by the way, to the individual power level of these cards: Deep Meditation, Grizzled Ranger, and Badger Bear. The fact that they still feel pretty much fine after the nerfs. Again, there's a chance Badger Bear gets swapped, there's a chance Meditation goes down to 2, but that's about it. But yeah, again, like Vikkarina, it's another deck that some people say is tier 1 and some people say is omega bad, so we'll see. Then we've got Sea Monsters. Sea Monsters is a deck that kind of directly didn't change, but indirectly it did, which is to say other decks got worse. That's it. I mean, again, when you nerf the entirety of tier 1, everything that dodges those nerfs just gets better. And Sea Monsters is a good way to dodge those nerfs. Like, Sea Monsters has nothing that got nerfed, and that's pretty big for it. Now, again, the biggest problem with a deck like this is kind of like Ionia being the throne of like control combo right now. So a lot of your stuff, like when you drop Nautilus into Will, that's usually pretty game losing. It's often hard to recover from that, just because they're often going to be in states where they're feeling good. So overall, it's hard to say whether Sea Monsters will be a tier 2 or a tier 3 deck. I suspect that Sea Monsters will stabilize at tier 3. I actually do. The reason I don't want to put it in tier 3 now, tier 2, so like in this update, tier 2 to me, what tier 2 says is has potential. Who knows, right? I would guess Sea Monsters would go down to a tier 3 deck. But I want to be a little optimistic. I want to see what of these kind of like new styles of decks could be good. And B, it's definitely a chance it ends up being, in tier 2 overall. It's like a new meta and it can be very hard to predict these things, but Sea Monsters does demonstrate a lot of the traits of a fairly non-competitive deck. I shouldn't say non-competitive. It's not a weak deck, but it's more likely it ends up tier 3 than tier 2. And we've got good old Misfortune Scouts. This one isn't really going too far. Unlike Bannerman, this one keeps the Badger Bear in it because you really kind of want that extra point of attack. You're just kind of going ham, going face. This deck started to see, it was kind of getting phased out already, and it did receive nerfs. This is another deck that actually might end up being something like tier 3 in this case. It comes down to how the meta is going to settle. It's definitely going to be an alright deck, but I think that it ends up quite a bit worse than Bannerman at this point, if you're just looking for something like that. Like, one of the benefits of MF Scouts was kind of being better against something like Burn than Bannerman, which, this deck can at least like race Burn down, play a bit more aggressively for the early game. And this deck does feel the nerfs a bit more, like it's harder. Like, Bannerman can switch to Protege and they're fine, whereas this deck just feels the full brunt of the Badger Bear nerf. So overall, this is definitely a deck that is almost certainly not going to be tier 1, but it has a chance to maintain its tier 2 status. Yeah, I'm going to leave that take in. Again, even though this like multiple of these cards have received nerfs, again, those being Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger, the deck can't really cut either of them. It still needs to run these cards. It's still a large part of the game plan, and again, that speaks to how powerful the cards were. And then we've got 3 decks that I have actually been working on for the past couple of days since the patch got announced. I have them in tier 2. Like I said, right now tier 2 is kind of like potential status. Again, it puts me in a weird position, you know? So here's the thing. Let me be real with you guys for a second, okay? Which is that I do these tier lists, right? I do these tier lists every week, or ish, and there's kind of 2 different types of tier lists, and they're really different. There's the weeks where, you know, it's a normal week and I do like a statistical, like, okay, you know, here's what's good, here's what's been good, here's maybe there are predictions and there are takes, but mostly those are going to be kind of like reined in, right? And then when there's a balance update, I want to do like a tier list. I want to do like a thing where it's just like, okay, you know, this is what I predict or guess things might be. These are some decks that might be good. We'll see. It's really hard to say, right? And I guess my predicament is that, you know, it's just, I do them in the same series, right? Like some weeks are predictions and some weeks are kind of like stat-based analysis. And it's not really clear to you guys which week is which. Like I say at the start of the video, but I think a lot of people kind of like miss that. I don't make it clear enough because I've seen some comments who've like, you know, watched some of the prediction weeks and they're like, oh, Swim, these meta snapshots by Swim are inaccurate. He switches them like, you know, the last time I saw this week where he switched like 3 of them down anyway. And it's very fair because some of I think I am sometimes incorrectly giving the impression that, you know, some things are fixed in stone when they're not. Maybe I need like a different series or something like that. I don't know. It's really hard because, you know, there's not really a way to update this page in a way that will convey that in a really just in your face way. Maybe it should just be a different page. I don't know. Let me know if you guys have any ideas to this predicament because I do really I do really want to make it clear like when it's, you know, I want to differentiate. Anyway, sorry for that little ramble. I was kind of basically saying that because there's a few decks here that are, I guess, a little interesting. Now, this is a very interesting deck. Again, like Sea Monsters, this is probably going to end up in tier 3, but it has potential. It actually does. It's interesting, and it uses a new card, which, of course, is Monkey Idol, which got buffed recently. So this is a deck that I was actually playing. I played this before the balance patch was known, before the patch notes were even out. I wasn't running Monkey Idol on the list, but the idea was Dawn Speakers with kegs, right? Dreadway Deckhand and Petty Officer generate kegs, and you can kill the kegs with, you know, Make It Rain. The opponent can have them die on their own, and basically, like when a keg dies, which, you know, or when anything dies, your Dawn Speakers will buff the whole board. So summoning kegs is just kind of a way of like double summoning units and helping trigger deaths for Dawn Speakers, which is really nice. Now, Monkey Idol's getting buffed, and that is one thing that I didn't mention on the patch notes, but it's going to 5 health. And of course, Monkey Idol has really good synergy with Dawn Speakers because it summons a unit that will die every turn. It's like a multi-unit card. It will end up like potentially getting buffed by Dawn Speakers, maybe surviving to summon a 4th monkey. Who knows? Overall, it ends up being a bit of a scout deck. As you can clearly see, we're also running like Misfortune Quinn. We're outside of the Bannerman plan because we are deeper into Bilgewater, and a lot of the early scout decks were doing the same thing, which is, you know, cutting the Bannerman plan and getting into this Bilgewater, but this deck does it in a different way. It's quite interesting. I'm going to be messing around with this deck probably today. Well, I say today, it's tomorrow for me, but it's probably today if you're watching this video. Actually, it's today for me. Shit, it's past midnight. Whoops. But anyway, this is a deck that actually has some potential. I think it's better than it looks, and there's actually a chance it ends up being better than something like MF Scouts, although I think it's unlikely, and I also think that it's kind of not even that comparable because this is much more of a slower deck. Even though it's using a lot of like early tools, Dawn Speakers slows the deck down quite a bit and ends up being almost more mid-rangey. Okay, so that's just kind of my Keg Speakers deck. We'll see how well that goes. And then we've got Fizz combo. So if you were watching my stream earlier today, well, I say today, but it was yesterday for you guys, you might have noticed we concocted this deck. This is a deck that probably looks like real doo-doo, huh? We were able to get over a... I'd have to go through. It was somewhere between a 60 and a 70% win rate with this deck in Masters, which is pretty good. I think it was like in the low 60s. It's not super amazing, but pretty solid win rate. And this is a deck that, of course, is getting better. The reason we were playing around with this idea is because this is a concept that's getting buffed. So, again, the idea is anything that's not getting nerfed is getting buffed. This deck is dodging nerfs. Also, Trump the Waters is getting an extra point in health. And this deck actually plays Trump the Waters a decent amount. It could make a difference, who knows. So, overall, let's break this down. You're running Fizz and Starlit Seer. You're running Entreat to pull Fizz, and you're also running Shared Spoils, which will pull, the top unit, right? And Entreat pulls the top champion as well, so it'll pull a buffed Fizz if Fizz is, the top unit of your deck. It'll be the one Starlit Seers are buffing. That's really important, by the way. So the way this deck plays is trying to abuse that really hard. You buff something big with your Starlit Seer, and then you pull it out with Entreat or Shared Spoils. Right? You get a big Fizz on the board, and they can't do anything about it. So the deck works for several reasons. One, it's basically the ultimate Starlit Seer deck, right? It's using Starlit Seer in a way that the opponent can't really counter. There's a couple reasons for this. Reason A is that when you buff something, you're making that thing very vulnerable to, removal, like Will of Ionia. Of course, Fizz dodges removal. He's immune to that. Another really big thing, you might say, well, what about pilfered goods? What about plunders? What about black market merchant? They can take your buffs. That's a large part of the reason, actually, why stuff like Starlit Seer has fallen off. And that's about to be a bigger part of the reason, because we're going to see more Bilgewater and more plunder after this patch. Those cards can't steal champions. Right? So when your Starlit Seer is buffing, a Fizz or whatever, and, usually they're going to be drawing spells anyway. There's a chance they'll get a buffed Starlit Seer out of your deck, but it ends up being pretty rare. They can't draw your Fizz with those cards. You can't draw a champion from the opponent's deck. So what that means is they'll actually be drawing me closer to my Fizz. Because when you're playing like Pilfered Goods, you draw from the top 2 cards in the deck, but if it's a champion, you ignore it. Which means that when I go to my next draw, after you just played Pilfered Goods, my odds of hitting Fizz triple, which is pretty crazy. So it actually ends up, if anything, being beneficial to this list, because I'll often be drawing into a buffed Fizz right after a Pilfered Goods comes down. Overall, I love this list. I can't tell you that enough. I'm going to make a standalone video guide for this list. I've already, did a full stream with it. I got a lot of like highlights. We'll be putting those on like YouTube, here. And there's a ton of fun you'll have with this list. It's just a really, really fun, just all-in combo deck. You end up with like 10 attack Fizzes. Of course, your opponent can't do anything about it. They can't use, Will of Ionia or Grasp. Anything they try to cast just gets fizzled. And of course, you can buff it with Battle Fury as well, which is a nice contingency if you don't draw Starlit Seer or if something else were to go wrong. Anyway, enough about this deck. But overall, it's actually fairly solid. Again, it's a deck that could end up in tier 2 or tier 3. We'll have to see. It's not going to be a tier 1 deck, but it's actually not bad. It's certainly a lot better than it looks. I know when you look at it, it probably seems really bad because it's like using Fizz and it's using Ionia, and it's using Fizz and it's using Freljord, and those are 2 things that are generally considered to be bad. But after the patch, as well as like the way it's specifically using these, makes it quite solid. Trust me, it's not bad. Twisted Fate Slotbot, okay? So this is pretty interesting as a deck. Slotbot is getting pretty buffed. It's getting +1/+1 for free. So it's 3 mana 1/4 now, which is pretty huge. So this is the all-in Twisted Fate combo. We happen to be running Fizz here, although Fizz is much more expendable in this list. It's just your super standard Twisted Fate. In this case, we're splashing Rummage. In the past, I've splashed like Ionia stuff, but I think Deep Meditation's nerf is actually enough to get me to swap off to PNZ. We'll see if this version ends up working out. There's a chance you could be out of Allegiance. There's a chance that you could be in a different splash. But one thing I do know is that Twisted Fate, Black Market Merchant, and Pilfered Goods is a very good combo. The idea of a committed level up Twisted Fate deck is actually going to be pretty decent after this update. And this is one of the better ways to use it. Lastly, Slotbot is a decent card all of a sudden. It's sort of crazy. I don't know if it's going to be amazing. It definitely might end up being improper in the list. Maybe I'll cut it. And there's a chance it could be like a 2 of or something like that. Maybe it's not a 3 of at all. But the fact that it starts at a 1/4, like when you play it next turn, you're already getting 6 stats on a 3 mana card, right? Because it's a 1/4, that's 5 stats. And then immediately the next turn after you play it, it turns into 6 stats off of just the natural draw, right? And of course, this deck draws a lot, so it's going to get more stats. I think Slotbot will end up, at the very least, quite solid in these kinds of lists. But yeah, that's just another deck that could be decent. Twisted Keg Control. This is a concept we were tooling around with a while ago. Keg Control is very interesting. Twisted Fate is going to be better. This is exactly the kind of deck that will be better in this update. Like, again, this update is just the perfect example of just like dodging nerfs being important, because I guess I've said this like 6 times in this video already. But every single thing in tier 1 and tier 2 got nerfed. Every single deck. And that's a big deal. Most balance patches aren't quite like that. There's usually some stuff in tier 1 or tier 2 that kind of slide under the radar, and then they end up being good. Everything in tier 1 and tier 2 got nerfed. So what that means is like a lot of these decks are rising up. A lot of like the tier 3 decks that felt like they didn't have as much potential before are rising up, right? So something like Twisted Keg Control could end up making a bit more sense than it has in the past. And then there's the tier 3 decks, which I tend to not talk too much about on these sort of like, you know, meta analyses. We'll be skipping them here, but if you want to check them out, you can check out the website. Lastly, we've got Standalone OTK, which is a very sad story. Standalone going to 4 mana makes the card absolutely dead. Super dead. You cannot play Standalone anymore. It's not a real card. So Standalone OTK has downgraded to Keck W tier. Rest in pieces, Standalone OTK. Now, if you were a Standalone OTK player, first of all, what's wrong with you? And second of all, you'll be happy to note that Fizz combo is a very, very fun, similar playstyle. If you liked Standalone OTK, you will love Fizz combo. And I'm going to be playing the shit out of this list. Alright guys, anyway, that's going to be it for me. I have to go to bed because I have to wake up in the morning to stream. But I will see you guys tomorrow. It's going to be a fun several days. I think a lot of people overfocus on tier 1. I'm sure like half of you guys, like when you loaded up the video, you glanced at tier 1 and you're like, ugh, but tier 1's just all the same decks. Yeah, I mean, they would have to buff things really big for tier 1 to not be decks we've seen before. In reality, the bigger focus is tier 2. And again, I think everyone just looks at tier 2. Like when you say the phrase tier 2, it just sounds bad, like derogatory, you know? But it's tier 2 are powerful decks. These are all just good decks. They're, you know, 3% less win rate than tier 1. Sometimes, pretty often less than that, right? So overall, there's nothing wrong with tier 2 decks. And yeah, tier 1 are solid, staple decks, but there is, I think, a large amount of diversity in the experimentation we'll see, and a lot of the tier 2 decks to move forward. I think Freljord and Bilgewater are actually pretty well positioned, more so than you might think. The Kindly Tavern Keeper buff is really huge, and we're going to see some Freljord decks start to pop off. But yeah, that's going to be it for me for this episode of Meta whenever the hell I feel like it. Tune in next week, which I think I'll do it on Tuesday. I think, like, you know how when your sleep schedule is messed up and you just have to, like, you know, start going to sleep an hour early? every night. Yeah, it takes several days to adjust it, right? Last week we did it on Thursday. This week's Wednesday. Next week, we'll get there. We'll get back to Monday. That's it for me. That's all I got. See ya.